Hello everyone. About 12 months ago, I thought I would put together a video comparing the Mark 9 Spitfires in both DCS and IL2. However, I got delayed putting this video together mainly because I was waiting for various things to be complete in one or the other of these modules. And parts of this work is still not finished, so I've given up waiting and I'm just going to produce the comparison video in the state these modules are in now. Part of the reason I've decided to do this is because I saw a comparison video by iFly Central, which is well worth watching, and it reminded me that I had this project on the back burner, so I decided to make a start. Unfortunately, I got through about 40 minutes of footage and I was still on the cockpits. So instead of producing one video comparing lots of aspects of these two aircraft, I've decided to break this down into a series of videos, and this is the first in the series, and I'm going to be focusing exclusively in this video on the cockpits. We'll now take a look at the cockpits of how these aircraft are modelled in both IL2 and DCS. This is the IL2 Spitfire Mark 9, and for the sake of consistency, I've tried to set these aircraft up so that the lighting conditions will be about the same. You can see approximately half of the control panel, the dash there, is in shadow and approximately half is in the sun. I've got the sun just slightly behind the left wing in order to achieve this. So when we jump into the DCS Spitfire, we should have something similar. They won't be exactly the same, but we do the best we can. Taking a quick look at the overall layout of the cockpit, I've got the hatch down here. You can see there's nothing too outrageous or noteworthy to discuss when we're just having a look around like this. And it's not until we zoom in a bit and start having a close look at the aircraft that we can really talk about the build quality in IL2. So let's do that. We're going to zoom the view in, or reduce the field of view until it won't go any further. So that is the minimum field of view in degrees that I can achieve in IL2. And I'm just making a note that the main instrument panel here fits inside my view with a bit to spare on either side. So when we go in to look at the cockpit in DCS, I'm going to try and set the field of view to the same. And I can lean in and lean out just a little bit with track IR. So the first thing I want to take a look at is just to look for gaps in the structure of the 3D model itself. And we cast our eye around, looking for the seams between the 3D pieces, just to see if there's anywhere where the outside world is bleeding through. And I don't see anything. It looks like a well-sealed 3D model, and there are no obvious seams or gaps. Everything seems to have been connected together properly, and no little nasties have been left floating around unnoticed. You'll notice this metal box here. There is a flat panel which we can see sort of front on from this angle here, just beneath the carb air and behind the carb air filter. And as you can see, that piece of metal has no depth whatsoever. It is simply a flat plate in 2D. It has no 3D depth. Now we'll discuss that when we get to the DCS Spitfire, but it would be impossible to make a piece of metal that thin. So there are a couple of places that shortcuts have been taken, but we'll see how that compares to the DCS one a bit later. So no major gaps, and the cockpit overall seems well put together. Now onto the instruments. A couple of things I'm looking for here is, firstly, to see how the text looks, to make sure everything's readable, and ideally we want pixelation to occur as late as possible. And by late, I mean with the narrowest field of view. At this field of view, I can already see quite a lot of pixelation. Almost all of the text here is pixelated, and it's clear that the, let's say the font size is sort of at the edge of its envelope. If we just take the field of view back out, this looks about right. The font or the textures they've used for the text renders quite nicely at about this field of view, but once we get into the minimum field of view, I can see the pixelation on almost every number and letter, including the needles. In fact, some of these needles are 3D objects, so it's not as blatant, but certainly the textures on the instrument panels themselves, I can see that they are pixelated. The text is pixelated. And when we get up to the gun sight here, which is much closer to the face, you can also see it's quite pixelated. The panels, the instruments themselves, don't really appear very deep. It's kind of hard to tell at times. Here, when we've got a bit of light on them, you can see that they've got nice 3D depth. But when they're in shadow and the lighting's much flatter, it can be a little bit deceptive. But it's not a big problem at all. They are clearly 3D objects. The only thing that seems a bit weird is the glass on each of the instruments. And I can't tell if there actually is glass there or not. There's no obvious reflections off anything. The reflections seem to be just coming off the back panels of each of the instruments. This is the black back panel. That boost gauge may have glass. There does appear to be a sort of greenish whitish ring down in the bottom right hand corner, but it's hard to tell if they've modelled an actual glass or a perspex cover on these instruments. General texture quality is pretty good. Now these are not 4K textures. IL2 does not yet have 4K textures, but they are coming soon. And I was going to hold off on making this video until the 4K textures came out, but I realized there's always improvements to these games, and we can just hold off and hold off and hold off forever, waiting for new things to come out to improve them. So I'll stick with the textures we've got. You can see here the pixelation in the textures is quite obvious, but it's fine. When you're out here, which is your normal field of view for flying and playing, everything looks fine. But when we get into this sort of level, we can see the texture quality. Now some of these textures are quite different. This texture here, this black panel at the base of the canopy, that's very weird. It appears incredibly blurry, like the texture is actually missing. And then this piece here is textured. It's very weird to see a change in these two different types of texturing. I'm not sure whether they just decided for the sake of frame rates or some other reason just to take shortcuts on some of these pieces and not others. I don't really understand why they look so different. It should just be exactly the same. It's the same material. It's even held in with the same bolts and screws, but anyway, or bolts and nuts rather. Nuts and bolts. Then looking at the back of the airplane, this is where things become a bit more obvious. There's the back seat. You can see the texturing quite clearly there on the armoured panel and the seat itself there. Now, I did mention before about there not being any gaps. Now, there appear to be some strange kind of polygon shapes cut out of or cut into this chair. I'm not sure if that's meant to represent wear and tear, but it looks like they've kind of got some light bleed around the side. It's a very weird situation. Certainly the texture quality here is not great, and you can see it very obviously on the leather seat there. But once you zoom out, it's fine. So if you don't want to be upset, just don't zoom right in. Now for lighting, you can see they've done a pretty good job of the lighting here. The lit side of the cockpit looks really good. I've got some nice reflections bouncing off this polished or worn side here, and when I move my head around, you can see the reflections shimmering. The various metal pieces which are sun facing do reflect the light quite nicely. There's some good reflections throughout this cockpit here. When we go to the dark side, you can see some really good shadowing, particularly in the footwell. I mean, it's really dark down there. And the shadowing on the instruments Just at the back of each instrument, you can see there's shadowing around them. Really nice transition here from dark over to light. It looks pretty good. The lighting in these cockpits looks pretty good. There's some very nice glare off the wing surface there. I think they've done a good job. Shadow quality itself is also very nice. You can see these shadows here. Because track IR is constantly moving around, the shadows are constantly adjusting. But overall, they look good. They're nice, consistent, straight shadows. We've got some shadows falling on the canopy there as well. And at the back of the aeroplane, you can see pretty good quality shadows. A little bit fuzzy and jaggy around the edge, but they're nice and consistent. And they don't jump around and wobble about, provided you keep your head relatively still. Now, there is no pilot shadow modelled in this aircraft. It's a bit hard to see now, but if we look at the cockpit there, you can see the cockpit is open on the wing. There is no pilot modelled. So there is no pilot shadow. But everything else seems to be casting shadows, except there's nothing for the pilot. Last thing I just want to check is the 3D objects and how they are built. If we zoom in on some of the curvy objects, I like to use these metal 2-position switches. You can see that the circular bobble, or whatever it's called, on top is actually comprised of 10 or 11, maybe 12 straight lines that make up what should be a circle. And then moving over here, you can see the instruments themselves are actually comprised of a series of straight lines. And other circular objects are obviously comprised of a series of straight lines put together that are visible at this level of zoom. The rivets in the cockpit are not consistent. You can see some of them are standing out as 3D objects. These ones here, either side of the artificial horizon, are actually 3D rivets, and yet these screws around the vertical speed indicator are just part of the 3D texture itself. So I'm not quite sure what the decision-making process was behind having some of those as 3D objects and having other ones just as part of the textures. So that's the cockpit of the IL2 Spitfire. Like I said, I think when you're at this level of field of view, everything looks really nice. Lighting's good, shadows are good. But there are a few little niggly problems which show when you narrow your field of view, and then you start noticing that some of the textures are just a bit weak perhaps, and a couple of other little bits and pieces appear to be shortcuts perhaps for the sake of frame rate. Welcome now to the DCS Spitfire cockpit, and here is the sort of wide view before we get stuck into the detail. Just having a bit of a scan around. Mainly to take in the overall ambiance. Now let's zoom in and we'll start the critical section of this. So we'll set the same field of view that we had in IL2, which is about there. Now I could go in a lot further, but I'm not going to because I want this comparison to be fair. And as you can see, I've got about half of the dash in shadow, sort of angled down to the bottom right. The sun is almost in the same position actually. That's not too bad. It won't be exactly the same, but it'll be good enough, I think, for us to make the appropriate comparisons. So let's go back to the level of field of view that we want, which is going to be about here. And the first thing I'm going to do is exactly what we did in IL2, and that is scan around the cockpit looking for gaps and looking for light bleeding through the various seams, if there are any, just to check that the 3D model has been put together properly and all the bits are stuck in and attached to all the other bits. Now it looks fine. I'm not seeing anything, just as we saw nothing of note really in IL2. We are not noticing anything here. See if I can get a view of the seat, and there are no weird polygon shapes on the seat in this one. We talked about this piece. I can actually use the mouse to show you what I'm talking about now. We talked about this plate of metal in the IL2 aircraft, and particularly this piece here, where my mouse cursor is, the little yellow cross. Now, just as in IL2, In DCS, this is also a two-dimensional flat panel. It has no depth, it has no extrusion. So in fact, it's a little bit worse in DCS because when you move your head behind the panel, it's completely disappeared. It's got a texture just on one side. The other side has no texture, so it's completely invisible. But it's also just a two-dimensional shape. It is not actually a 3D object with any extrusion whatsoever. So when your head's over here, it looks okay, but as soon as you move your head up to this position, the piece of metal just disappears. So I think both developers have taken a shortcut here with these plates, and they've forgotten to give them depth. All it needs is a couple of millimeters of depth, whatever the actual piece is in real life, but there's no way that in real life those metal plates had 0 depth. So a common mistake or a common shortcut has been made by both developers on that piece of the airplane. It's interesting that they chose that same piece to make the same decisions. Now we can move to the instruments, and here we're looking again to see if we can spot glass and to look at the 3D depth of the instruments. And in this case, it's clear to me that there is a glass piece on top of each of the instruments, and that is mainly because Eagle Dynamics have chosen to add these baked on reflections to the instruments and to the glass. And we'll discuss that in a bit more detail at the end of this section. It's something that IL2 does not have, and I will make clear my thoughts on that a bit later. Looking at the the text quality, it is very good. There is almost no pixelation. In fact, I don't see any pixelation, maybe a fraction occasionally. But there is a significant difference between the quality of the instruments in this cockpit to what we saw in the IL2 cockpit. The text is really, really fantastic. The needles are incredible, and it looks really, really good. And then we only start seeing pixelation when we push our face right in. And you can see on the gun sight, just as we saw in IL2, the gun sight text is a bit pixelated. But this is of far, far higher quality to what we saw in the IL2 aircraft. You can in fact zoom all the way to, I think this is a 20-degree field of view here. And even then, these instruments look great. Now this is the 512 textures. This is not the top level of texturing available in DCS. You can go all the way up to double this, 1024. I do not use the 1024 textures, but given that IL2's 4K textures are not out yet, I think it's fair to use the next level down in DCS from the top ones. I think if I was looking at 4K textures in IL2, then I would look at the 1024 variant here in DCS as well. As for cockpit lighting, it seems a little bit flatter, and the only reason I say that is because some of these shadowed areas, particularly the footwell, seem very brightly lit. And I can see everything right back there. I'm just going to push the rudder forward. And everything right back there in the footwell is very well lit. It's like there's a source of light down there. Now maybe there is some bleed which comes through of ambient lighting into the footwells of these cockpits, but I suspect that actually that should be in shadow. And I think IL2's done a better job of capturing the shadowed sections of the cockpit, which just makes the overall contrast between the shadowed sections and the lit sections look better. Now, of course, these sims have gamma sliders. I'm just going to open up the options here and drag the gamma slider down. I have it set to 1.8. If we go down to 1, you'll notice that situation changes quite dramatically. And now it is super dark down there and super light in these lit areas. So suddenly we've gone from a situation where the DCS cockpits lack in terms of contrast and depth to a situation where it's really, really extreme. Now we'll just go to a compromise between those two positions of about 1.4, 1.5. Let's go with 1.6. No, 1.5 will do. Make up your mind. And that's a bit better, but still I find it hard to believe that this section is so much darker than that. I just think they haven't quite got the light versus dark areas right. But it's a minor quibble, and like I say, you can do lots of adjustments with gamma sliders in both IL2 and DCS. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous to be too critical of how they've implemented lighting, because a lot of this is down to your own setup, your own PC, and the options you choose. Now we can look at shadows, and probably quite a few of you noticed right from the start when we spawned in that the shadows are a little bit funny. Now if I pause my track IR, so let's just move over here, pause the track IR, you'll see that even with track IR completely paused, there is a little bit of flickering, but it's probably tolerable. As soon as my head starts moving around, it really has a lot of trouble tracking where those shadows should be. And it's drawing and then not drawing and then drawing and not drawing, particularly the edge sections. And it just looks a little bit, I don't know, distracting is probably the word. Plus they tend to be quite pixelated around the edge. You can see it's quite sort of jaggy around here. And I've got the shadow set to high. So I just think this needs a bit more attention. Very flashy over here. It's a bit distracting. Now there is a pilot shadow, and if I just put the cursor over here, you can see there is a pilot's head shadow there. And if we just go out the canopy and try and look over the side, we may be able to see the pilot's head just there, just peeping over. And if I move my head a little bit, that shadow also just moves. It's not the best of views. When you have the sun directly in front of you, the pilot shadow is very visible on the armoured plate behind the pilot there, and it does respond a little bit. It doesn't move as extreme as your head does with the track IR, but it does actually respond to the pilot's head movement. So I think that's really nice. They appear to have modelled more shadows in DCS. There are more of them. However, I think the IL2 ones look better. We'll take a look at the general texture quality here. So just getting that same level of zoom again that we had in IL2. And we've got nice sort of scratched up sections here, a little bit pixelated there, but as you can see where the materials are the same, they've used the same textures. There don't appear to be any real sort of shortcut areas. That one there looks a little bit weak. That could probably do with some improvements. But up here, some of the stuff looks really, really nice. Some of these textures are quite outstanding. Now if we go to the back, and like I said, this is only the 512. This here is the seat, and I'm really hoping I can get a better view of the seat there. There's some seat in sunlight. The seat is a step ahead of the seat in IL2. It's a really nice looking leather surface. It's not just a bunch of mottled purple, black and yellow textures, pixels all smashed together. It is an actual looking, nice looking kind of crumpled old leather texture. It's very, very good. I very much prefer the textures that we see here in this cockpit. Now we'll take a look at the 3D objects that we looked at on the dash in IL2, and in fact in the DCS cockpit, all of the screws and rivets, or the screws at least, they're all 3D objects. There may be one or two just on the supercharge indicator which are painted on, but far more of them here are actual nuts and bolts and screws. They're all 3D objects. They all protrude properly from the dash. I'm not sure about the riveting along here. They may be just 2D textures. Yeah, I think that's the case. But certainly on the dash here, all of these screws, all the bolts and their nuts are 3D objects. So just a little bit of a higher count when it comes to 3D objects in this aircraft. I did mention I wanted to talk about the baked on reflections. I'm going to zoom up here to this section of canopy glass, and you can see there's this sort of pattern here. There is a circular object there which I think is supposed to be a reflection of one of the, it's probably the wobble pump which is supposed to be reflecting off there. I'm not entirely sure. And there are reflections on the side here. Now these are not actual reflections. These are just semi-opaque textures which have been slapped onto the canopy itself. When you are out here with this kind of field of view, and if your head is still, they look quite nice. But as soon as you start moving, you realize they don't move in a natural way at all. They're just baked onto the canopy glass. And for me, they are a massive distraction, and I really don't understand why Eagle Dynamics have kept them. I'm sure they could save themselves some workload or save themselves some file sizes, etc., 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 just by simply getting rid of them. I think they add absolutely no value to these modules, and I think they should be gotten rid of forthwith and toot sweet, because I don't like them. They are unrealistic and they look jolly ugly. So that's one thing that this cockpit does have, which the IL2 cockpit does not have. And for me, this is a major bone of contention, a bane of contention, a bone of contention. I guess you could contend a bone, especially if you were a dog and there was another dog also contending it. But yes, I would get rid of those if I was the boss, which I'm not. So currently they remain. Thanks very much for watching the first video in this comparison series. In the next one, we're going to take a look at the exterior of the aircraft. We're going to be looking at the electric lighting systems, and we're going to be listening to some of the audio. So until then, happy hunting, and I'll see you up there.